Happy Friday, guys. Welcome to day 13 of remote learning and civics. Today we're going to review the Article 3 worksheet that you guys completed the past 2 days. Make sure that you guys have all the definitions and all the questions answered correctly on your worksheet, because you're going to be using that worksheet next week on Monday to complete a ZISH. So as we know, our ZISH are open notes. Make sure you have all the correct notes on this worksheet so you can be successful on that ZISH. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to and get out your worksheet so that you can copy down all the right answers. All right, if you're ready to rock and roll here, let me share my screen, pull up the first part of the Article 3 worksheet. So Section 1 of Article 3 reads, "The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish." So Article 3, what branch of government, is obviously all about the judicial branch. The word judicial refers to the act of judging. So we're talking about judges and courts, talking about judging your actions or judging a law, judging something in a court of law, trying to examine it and figure out the truth using facts. Another definition of judicial would be to administer justice. Justice is fairness, making sure we come to the truth, again, using facts and evidence. The word judiciary is actually not in the passage. I just wanted to throw it in there because that's what the judicial branch is. It is the judiciary. The judiciary is a system of courts and judges. So that's what the judicial branch is all about. You should think of courts when you think of the judicial branch. What is the only specific court that the Constitution created? The only specific court is the Supreme Court. So it's said that inferior courts could be created or established from time to time. Inferior means lower in rank. So the only specific court created here is the Supreme Court, all the way at the top. We have many different levels of courts underneath. We have different inferior courts or lower courts. And how have these courts been established throughout our history? Well, it says that Congress can establish these courts. So as we go farther into our judicial branch unit, we're actually going to look at all the different levels of courts in the US court system and the state court system here in Florida. So we're not going to get into that just yet. We're just focusing on what the Constitution says about Article 3. All right, moving on to our next passage. It says, "The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their office during good behavior." So a judge is somebody who decides questions brought before a court. So I like to think of a judge in a courtroom kind of like the referee of a sports game. They're the ones there to make sure everybody's playing by the rules. They're there to, know the rule book and apply the rule book if they ever need to. So they answer any sort of legal questions brought before the court. Now, in some lower courts, judges also determine if somebody is innocent or guilty, determine somebody's punishment, things like that. At higher courts, actually a judge doesn't determine if you're innocent or guilty. That would be a jury that determines if you're innocent or guilty. But the judge still could apply a punishment towards you. But again, I like to think of the judge as the referee. He is the rules keeper and will answer any legal questions brought before the court. The question over here is, what is the only qualification to be a judge for both the Supreme Court and inferior courts? So if you remember, we talked about congressmen, and when we talked about the president, each of them had 3 qualifications: an age qualification, a citizenship qualification. But Here in Article 3, all it says to be a judge is to have good behavior. What does that mean? I don't know. It's very vague. I suppose as long as you don't get arrested and you're not just sentencing everybody to death. I don't know. Good behavior. It's very vague. So really, there are no real requirements to be a judge. Something like 70, 80 years ago, we had our last Supreme Court justice, the highest court in our country. Actually, somebody made it all the way to the Supreme Court and never even went to school for law, taught himself law. So kind of crazy. All right, moving on here. Section 2. Passage reads, "The judicial power shall extend to all cases arising under this Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties, to all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, to all cases of maritime jurisdiction, to controversies to which the United States shall be a party, to controversies between two or more states, between citizens of different states." So this passage may seem a little choppy. That's because, well, I chopped it up. Every time you see this ellipses, this ... that means there's actually more in the passage. I just cut it out. But what this passage is all about is listing the different types of cases heard by the Supreme Court. So we're going to simplify that list below, but let's go through the vocabulary first. Jurisdiction means having the power or authority over something. So when we talk about a court, jurisdiction means that the court has the power or authority to hear a certain type of case. We're going to talk a little bit more about jurisdiction on part 2 of the worksheet. Maritime, just threw that in there because I'm sure you're not familiar with that word. Just relates to the sea or the ocean, so it has to do with the open water. And then controversy, this word is used a few times in this passage. A controversy is a dispute or an argument. So let's go through this list over here. So again, what section 2 is listing are the different types of cases that the Supreme Court will hear. They hear very specific cases. So they're not going to hear cases like murder and theft. There has to be some bigger issue involved if the Supreme Court were ever to hear a case like that. So the first one listed, number 1, it says they will hear all cases about the Constitution. So if there's any argument, if there's any dispute, any controversy, anything that deals with the Constitution, the Supreme Court will hear that case. That's probably the most popular or the most common way that a court case will get to the Supreme Court, is that it deals with some constitutional issue. Maybe you think your constitutional rights were kept from you at your workplace. You thought your right to freedom of speech was violated. You could, bring somebody to court over that matter, and potentially that court case could go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So that's number 1, Constitution. Number 2, over here on our list, would be laws of the United States. So U.S. laws. So if there's any, again, controversy or dispute over a U.S. law, so that is a federal law, a law that Congress made, that court case could be brought to the Supreme Court as well. Also, number 3 over on our list is treaties of the United States. So U.S. treaties. So those would be treaties that the president made and the Senate had approved. Number 4 over here on our list, moving on in order here, is going to be ambassadors, ministers, and consuls. Essentially, ministers and consuls are very similar to what an ambassador is. An ambassador is somebody that represents our country in a foreign country. We don't really use the word minister anymore. It's kind of an archaic word, an old word. But for our sake, for our purposes, we can just say ambassadors. So if there were ever a case involving a U.S. ambassador, if you want to write minister and consul over there too, you're more than welcome to. But they all refer to somebody that represents our country in a foreign country. Number 5 over here is going to be anything that deals with maritime. So anything that deals with the open seas, anything that deals with some sort of something that happens out on the ocean, whether it deals with shipping or deals with the Navy, anything out on the ocean or sea waters. Number 6 is going to be controversies when the United States is a party. So in every court case, there are 2 sides to the court case. There is the defendant who is defending themselves. They're being accused of some sort of wrongdoing or crime. And then there's the plaintiff or the prosecutor, and they're the ones who are accusing the defendant of doing something wrong. So if the United States, the US government, the federal government is one of those sides, they're either the defendant, they're being accused of wrongdoing, or they're the prosecutor, they're the ones accusing someone of a crime or wrongdoing, then that court case could make it to the Supreme Court. We're going to talk more about plaintiff versus defendant and all of that specific trial stuff later in the unit. Number 7 here is going to be controversies between 2 or more states. So if, for example, Florida and Georgia were having a border dispute, and Georgia says, no, our border is over here, and Florida says, no, our border is up here, that controversy, that dispute could make it to the Supreme Court. And actually, it absolutely would make it to the Supreme Court, and that has to do with original jurisdiction, something we'll talk about in part 2 of our worksheet in just a moment. And then finally, number 8, the last type of case that the Supreme Court would hear would be a controversy between citizens of different states. So if you in Florida made a business transaction with somebody in Alabama and they never followed through, and you are bringing them to court, again, that dispute between 2 different citizens from 2 different states, that controversy, that dispute could be brought to the Supreme Court. All right, that was part 1. Let's continue on with part 2. So this is all still continuing on in section 2 of Article 3. First passage here reads, in all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, and those in which a state shall be a party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. All right, so in our last worksheet, we said jurisdiction is having the power or authority over a case, over a court case. Well, original jurisdiction means to have the power or the authority to hear a case for the first time. It's the power of a court to hear the case for the first time. So remember, jurisdiction is having the power or authority to hear a case. Original, if you think about what that word means, that means that that is the first, right? If you're the original person to do something, you're the first person to do something. If we look even at the beginning of the word origin, that means beginning. So having original jurisdiction means that the court has the power to be the first to hear the court case. That is where the court case will originate. That is where the court case will begin. So in 2 very rare cases, a court case is actually going to start at the Supreme Court. So that's our question over here. The Supreme Court has original jurisdiction when the case involves, the first thing that it lists is if the case involves ambassadors, ministers, and consuls. Again, if you just want to put the word ambassadors, since we don't really use the other words much nowadays, then that's fine. If you want to put ambassadors, ministers, and consuls here, go for it. So in the very rare case that a court case deals with an ambassador of the United States, then the Supreme Court will have original jurisdiction over that case, which means that court case is going to skip over all the lower courts and go straight to the top. It's going to start at the Supreme Court. The other type of case that is going to start at the Supreme Court is any court case in which a state shall be a party. So that previous example I gave you, if Florida and Georgia were having a border dispute, that court case, again, would jump all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It would start at the U.S. Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over that type of case. They have the power to hear that type of case for the very first time. Again, these two are very rare cases. Doesn't happen very often. Most cases are going to get to the Supreme Court on appeal, which is our next section down here. So the next passage says, in all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction. So we'll talk about what appellate jurisdiction is in just a second, but in order to understand that, you need to understand what an appeal is. So that's why I put this word here in the vocabulary list. An appeal is a request made to a higher court to review a case. So if you lose your court case at a lower court, you could make an appeal. You could make a request to a higher court to review your case, and they will review the decision of that lower court. So I'm going to refer to this image here. So this is a very basic structure of courts. We have trial courts at the bottom. This is where most court cases will start. They will hold trials for your crime or for some sort of civil dispute between people. At the next level, we have appellate courts or courts of appeal. They're the ones that will review cases from the lower courts, from the trial courts. And at the top, we have a Supreme Court. Again, eventually later in the unit, we're actually going to look at the various levels of courts, the names of those courts and what they do. This is just a very generic version just for the sake of the lecture today. But again, I want to explain what an appeal is. If you're down here at a trial court, let's say you get arrested for theft, or let's say you are being sued by your neighbor for doing damage to their property, whatever it is. You're at a trial court. Let's say you lose your trial, but during the trial, the judge did not allow you to enter certain things into evidence. Maybe one of your witnesses were excused. Maybe you thought the jury was biased, they were one-sided. Whatever the reason, if you thought that this lower court decision was unfair, if you think there was a mistake made, you could appeal your court case. And what that means is that you could make a request to the next highest court to review your court case. You can appeal your court case up to the next level court. Now, if you lose that court case, technically you could appeal it up to an even higher court. And that's usually how most court cases get to the Supreme Court, is that somebody keeps appealing their court case up and up this pyramid. Somebody keeps requesting a higher court to review their case until they're finally up to the Supreme Court. So again, most cases are going to reach the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction. What this means is that the court has the power to review appeals. The court has the power to review lower courts' decisions. Again, most court cases are going to make it to the Supreme Court on appeal. This original jurisdiction thing does not happen very often. There's not many disputes between states, and there's not many court cases involving ambassadors. So explaining the power of appellate jurisdiction in your own words, you could say something like it's the power to review a lower court decision. It's the power to listen to appeals made from lower courts. It's the authority to see if a lower court's decision was fair. Whatever you want to say on that. But just to go back to our chart one last time, the Supreme Court having appellate jurisdiction means that these lower courts can appeal their cases all the way up to the Supreme Court. This court has appellate jurisdiction because it can review those lower court decisions. All right, moving on to our last section here. The trial of all crimes, except in cases of impeachment, shall be by jury, and such trial shall be held in the state where the said crimes shall have been committed. So a pretty easy vocabulary here. A crime is an illegal act, so you did something that was against the law. A trial is where we examine evidence in a court to make a decision, usually a decision of guilty or not guilty, or making a decision of who was right and who was wrong. And a jury is an ordinary group of citizens that will examine that evidence to make a decision. So at lower courts, actually we don't have juries. Usually it's the judge that will examine the evidence and make a decision. But at higher courts, for more serious crimes, for more serious disputes, we will have a jury, and again, they will be the ones that actually make a decision, not the judge. Remember, the judge is more like the referee. He's making sure everybody's following the rules. Usually the jury will decide innocent or guilty, who's right, who's wrong. And then the judge will decide the punishment. All right, our questions for that section. Where are criminal trials held? Criminal trials are going to be held in the state where the crime was committed. So if you commit a crime in Georgia, but then you come back down here to Florida, if you were to be arrested here in Florida, they're actually going to bring you back up to Georgia. Your trial is going to be held back where you committed the crime. What will all criminal trials have? All criminal trials are going to have a jury. A jury is the way that we make sure that trials are fair. We don't want one person, one judge, making all the decisions. It's much better to have a group of 12 or however many ordinary citizens decide whether you're innocent or guilty. Makes it less biased. What is the only exception? Well, the only time that we don't have a jury is in cases of impeachment, right? We know that there is no jury, there's really no courtroom, right? It's the Senate who is going to determine whether or not you get removed from office. All right, guys, I hope that explains Article 3. I hope you guys copy down all the correct vocabulary and answers to those questions. If you have any questions or you want to talk about Article 3, as always, I'm available on Zoom every single day, Monday through Friday, from 1:20 to 2:05. So come by my office hours, and I'd love to further explain anything you'd like, or just message me on Edmodo, and I'll get back to you at my earliest convenience. So hope you guys are doing well. Hope you guys are getting caught up on all your work, and make sure you keep this worksheet safe because you'll need it Monday for your ZICH. So fare well and enjoy your weekend to the best of your ability.